change represents the most significant challenge of the 21st century and poses severe risks to water and sanitation services. The risks are higher and more intense in coastal areas given the higher vulnerability index due to their physical proximity to coastlines and increasing cyclonic activities. The WASH infrastructure to be climate resilient is of utmost importance since WASH infrastructure and services are central to the growth, sustenance, and normal functioning of any city. Our next panel discussion centers around climate resilient cities with a focus on coastal states. The session will be moderated by Ms. Aditi Pandey, Head of Partnerships and Communications at CDD India. Aditi currently heads Partnerships and Communications at CDD India. She comes with an extensive experience of about 15 years in domains of environment and social issues. A trained social worker from Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, she has been influential in forging strategic partnerships across various stakeholders, including public, private, multilateral, and non-profit organizations. She is one of the very few trained Indians who have studied nature-based solutions from Smith School of Enterprise and Environment, University of Oxford. Over to you, Aditi.
I would like to introduce and invite our distinguished panel. We have Ms. Nainalal Kedwai. She's the chair of India Sanitation Coalition. Sorry? Yeah, I mean, I don't know. We don't need him. Next, we have Dr. Ravi Mariwala, who's the founder of Smart Water. Dr. Mariwala has a PhD in chemical engineering from University of Delaware, where he authored 17 publications and received 5 patents for his work on carbon molecular sieves. And finally, we have Mr. Romit Sen, Senior Vice President of Corporate Sustainability at HSBC India. Mr. Sen conducts advanced multi-stakeholder engagement with the government, think tanks, research institutions, and not-for-profit organizations to enhance the visibility of HSBC India's sustainability initiatives and contribute to policy advocacy. He is an environment and sustainability professional with more than 18 years of experience in program development, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation, action research, and evidence-based advocacy. I would like to set the context a little based on the topic. We all have been talking about climate change and climate resilience, and I think our understanding based on each of our domains is a little varied. So I would like to ensure that we all are on the same page before we proceed so that we can make the most of this discussion. So today about 4.4 billion people live in urban areas, and this number is about to double up for the World Bank data. And in India, as much as the world, the physical hazards of climate change are becoming more severe and more frequent. One of the data of Cambridge research says that from 1992, we have had about 24,000 heat wave related deaths. And in the last year's report of S&P Global, it says that the country's economy is about to be hit, given that, and based on the physical risk than its peers, and this is about Indian economy, by 2050 because of high exposure to wildfires, floods, storms, and rising sea levels. Now, India, owing to its vast population and geography, is confronting a broad spectrum of disastrous consequences. And given that India is not an urban homogenic unit, there cannot be a standardized solution across the country, states. Within states, the variations are so much that the solutions need to be contextualized. Now, while we speak of this country as a whole, we also need to keep in mind that, and which the discussion will eventually take forward, that policies also cannot be standardized for the entire country because the solutioning will have to vary. So there has to be a buffer even in the policy for rural, for hilly regions, for coastal regions. Today the discussion will be focused on coastal regions primarily. The urban environment has very distinctive bioclimatical factors in comparison to rural areas. The process of urbanization alters the natural surface and the atmosphere of that region. The same thing that will have an effect, for instance, increase in the runoff water, or increased temperatures and decreased evaporation. The same phenomenon of evaporation in the rural surface will warm it up more than the urban. So the solutioning will vary again. Now, building climate resilience requires climate adaptation measures that enable communities and cities to withstand climate risks. This involves identifying climate risks, incorporating them into policy and investment discussions, supporting locally led adaptation efforts, and mobilizing finance for the climate solutions. And we'll now start with the questions. Ma'am, I'll start with you first. What are the key considerations for us to achieve the goal of climate resilient India, so to say?
I think as we look at this study, it's not to solve for climate change per se, but specifically looking at sanitation, plastic, water, the whole waste management space, and also to ensure that in looking at this resilience, we build right. So that policy then becomes very important. I'll take the example of an industry which I'm on a global board of, which is in building products. It's basically Holcim, which is an erstwhile cement company. I say erstwhile. Today, in the last 3 years, it's become a building products company, investing in a range of products to do with climate resilient buildings, which are much more energy efficient, looking at cladding material, looking at roofing material, so much more holistic. And so one aspect has to be about how we build and what we build. And that is urban planning, which is a hopeless disaster in our country. But if we can plan our cities, and we are building a new Chicago every year, so let's at least start with some of the new suburbs, the new buildings that we do, how we plan for that urban plan in a way that the buildings are energy efficient, but also that the waste management is efficient. And what I mean by this is that through technology and R&D, what companies like Holcim have done is they are getting more carbon efficient, less carbon intensive by not needing the traditional mining elements, but using reconstruction waste. The single factor of how you collect a building which you break down, take that material so it doesn't go to a landfill, collect it directly from the site, bring it to yours, treat it, and then use it for clinker. So it's, again, as we heard in the earlier panel, about the chain of collection. You don't go and mix it with vegetable waste. You're collecting it from site, so you don't have this issue of mixing it so that you can't fix it. And then comes the second aspect, which is the chain of payment. So the policy then comes in as to who pays for what. The person who has construction waste pays somebody to pick it up. The guys who pick it up are reconstruction waste companies. They have lots of MSMEs around in Europe who basically specialize in this. And then who pays to buy that reconstructed waste? And who pays what? Where does the profit margin lie? So that each person has a business proposition at the end of it. And that is the chain that is entirely broken at the moment in our country, because it's not regulated, for one, because it does need some element of regulation. You have to create the MSMEs who can make enough money doing it, not individual small contractors, but proper companies who are accountable. And there has to be a regulation that is very tight about where the stuff gets dumped. If I'm just paid to collect reconstruction waste, I take it, and you'd see mounds of it lying all over Delhi. This is valuable material for some cement company somewhere, but then how do you get it to the company? And our cement companies are largely in interiors. So the price of payment of collecting it from a city to send it to a plant which was built because it was built on a limestone reserve, whereas we need the cement plant now to be near a reconstruction waste, are all questions of who incentivizes these new companies to come up to use raw material, which is important. It took 20 years. I watched the fly ash brick industry coming up. Today, there's a shortage of fly ash bricks. But it took 20 years when we had fly ash coming out of our ears to even get the building industry interested in using fly ash brick. So we have to work faster, we have to work quicker, we have to know what those formats are in terms of what we build, how we build, and with what we are building as ingredients as we go forward. And then this whole area of collecting and planning. So coastal cities is the focus. So coastal cities by definition means we have to be resilient from floods, disasters, hurricanes, tidal waves. This is the new world of climate disruption. And there again, therefore, it is going to be about addressing these spaces on the sanitation infrastructure. Because if we're going to spend, as we are, loads and loads of money building new toilets and building what we have, the STPs and the treatment plants, but it's going to flood every year and break and ruin what we built, we have to think about how we build that. And lastly, I would just say livelihoods are a very important part of it. There's a whole range of livelihoods that can come from getting it right, a whole range of livelihoods that can be looking at plastic waste in the oceans and using plastic for what it is. And we heard in the last discussion as well, it's a huge deliverer of energy. I mean, the cement industry can use plastic freely in its kilns. So it's a huge generator of energy. It's a generator for raw material for multiple industries. So again, how we look at livelihoods and stick it together with the need of the day is going to be important. And lastly, this collaboration, partnership. That's the refrain you hear across every panel. How do we get that right?
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Ravi, so there are a lot of new technologies when we talk about climate adaptation or mitigation. There are a lot existing even in the West, but one of the key challenges in implementing the solutions on ground, either for adaptation or mitigation, is unaffordability for both the ULBs and the citizens. How do you think we can work around or cater to this challenge?
Thank you, Aditi, for the question. I think what you have described is really a very true challenge. But what I'd like to do is go one step further, not down, but further up. What we are thinking about is getting technologies and adapting the technologies as we are getting that. However, because of the heterogeneity of our coastline and our climatic zones and conditions, there is a certain degree of customization required at every couple of 100 miles or a few miles. And we have realized that. So we take an approach, something called the 70-30 or the 80-20 approach, where 70% of the technology or 80% of the technology is pretty standardized. And then you need to do a little bit of customization at the other end. Second thing which I always believe in is that there is nothing like high tech, low tech. It is always the right tech which wins. And what I mean by right tech is not just the cost of it. It has to deliver the performance. It has to deliver the cost. And it has to be easily engageable with people, because at the end of it, people are going to be learning this. So for example, one of the technologies which we have suggested for somebody is almost 250 years old, but that's the most relevant technology for the problem. So one has to really take some time to identify the problem and suggest the right kind of technologies and right kind of interfaces for doing that. Currently, if we look at it, there are some very interesting things which is driving the world ahead. And one of the big forces which is driving the world ahead is digitization. And using digitization cleverly becomes very, very interesting. It can be used very nicely to monitor the technology. It can be used very nicely to basically educate the people about technology. So what the question comes in is that we select the right technology. I think you will find that the cost and the life cycle cost of the technology is going to be quite affordable. But how do we get this across so that people can work around and cater to this cost factor what you have mentioned? Out here there is always a number of things which comes up, and there are two things which are very important. One is that we have to realize that uh, when you when you are availing a service, you need to pay for it. Okay, so an economic model needs to be created, or a business model needs to be created around that. Till now, I think, to put it very broadly, we have assumed that water is going to be free and the sewage is going to be going out quite okay, but we are paying a price in terms of the environmental degradation, we are paying a price in the terms of scarcity, and we are paying in the price in terms of healthcare issues which are coming up, and indirectly or directly we are paying for it. For example, if you have potable water today where there is scarcity, we have water tanker mafias which are already operating out there. The same thing is also happening with the sewage and the sanitation part also. So I think to break this nexus, we need to create a formal economic model whereby, let us say that you have treated sewage and construction sites do need water for carrying on construction activities. Can we use well treated sewage for construction activity? Can we create a market whereby there is some trading and there is some financing which is happening out here in this case? Second thing is the role of government. The government also has to understand that they are collecting taxes from us. So one of the reasons they collect taxes and they charge a cess, if you look at, on water bills of disposal, I think they need to provide at least the basic infrastructure for doing something in terms of either collection or treatment, etc. Though the private sector has taken a good cause or a good challenge of providing a small sewage treatment plants within their developments, is still not adequate, because it's a little bit of an eyewash. We still need to be more stringent, whereby we are meeting standards, and I think FICCI is working on it. I am also on that committee whereby we are deciding we need to look at reduce, reuse and recycle water, and for reusing and recycling water, the standards have to be specified so that water is what we call biologically stable, has a proper shelf life, and we can work with it, and does not cause any issues with public health. That's a very, very important part. Otherwise, it can become a large public nuisance, because if it's not treated properly, it's partially treated sewage, which is a big issue for the public. So if I was to kind of spell out 2 or 3 things which would help us adapt it in the urban areas and the coastal areas, what could be the best thing to do in terms of managing water and sanitation? One would be getting the right technology and the right partners for doing that. Second thing is we have to understand that we have to create an economic model around it, whereby we are able to finance it really well, and it's a self-sustaining model. Otherwise, it will fail down at some point in time, like what's happening today in the country. And third thing is the role of government needs to be more clarified. I think a little more debate on that part would be really going a long way, and we start moving in that direction. I think that would be good. And the last point I'd like to make is treating sewage. Just as the previous session we looked at mining waste, treating sewage as a resource is very important. We can extract a lot of interesting materials out of it. Energy for sure, it can be extracted and used very efficiently. There are some other elements which are of tremendous importance, which something like phosphorus, which is present in all the sewage water or wastewater, and we are today a net importer of phosphorus. And if we can recover that, that becomes a very interesting way to look at things. Recovering nitrogen-based materials as fertilizers. For example, in Israel, they are using sewage water to treat it to a level where they can use the water directly without much of fertilizer addition for irrigation purposes. So these are some of the interventions one can bring in effectively using technology, using deep knowledge, and you can create a viable economic model to run these through, which would help us do that particular part. Mind you, the problem of financing the STPs and the water and wash infrastructure in the developed world is also having lots and lots of issues. For example, in US today, most of their wash infrastructure is in a very bad shape. You saw what has happened in Flint, Michigan, where they had lead coming into water. It was a reason because their infrastructure was really fragile and it had broken down. And today, I think the Biden government has mandated that they're going to spend a lot of money on bringing up this kind of infrastructure. So I think private-public partnership is very essential to driving these things.
Thanks, Ravi. Romit, how is HSBC responding to the climate change, both globally and in India?
Thank you, Aditi. And okay, that's, I mean, quite a large, I would say the scope, but I think I would limit my response to more on, because, for us at HSBC, delivering a net zero economy is part of our business strategy also. It is one of the strategic goals that we have, but maybe I'll limit myself to more within the philanthropy and the, which is CSR space as to what we are doing. So while climate is a key pillar of our business strategy, there is engagement to advance climate transition for our clients and businesses. But I think within the philanthropy space, we have recognized this as a key imperative for economic development, sustaining livelihoods, and safeguarding our environment. So as part of our global philanthropic investments, which of course also comes to India, in 3 years ago we launched something called the Climate Solutions Partnership, which was like 100 million 5-year investment looking at 2 key areas of climate. And the 2 areas that we focused on, this is of course undergone some bit of revisions as part of a new philanthropy strategy, but energy transition was one. And within energy transition, we said that we'll have to, it was easier to kind of look at one solar installation here, one solar there, but we said that, how can access to renewables and how do you marry it with a developmental outcome? So in India, for our programs that we do in India, we said that we will follow a sectoral approach of enhancing renewable energy access for certain sectors. There are 3 major sectors that we picked up. One was dairy cold chain. And I think while doing so in our work, what we've realized that climate acts as a horizontal. And there are various intersections that climate has. So when you say that you kind of work on a specific area of climate, and your focus and ambit will be limited to, say, one geography, one area. But I think your experience tells you that as a horizontal, climate brings out different intersections, which, again, the learnings from your work could serve as solutions for others. So in the dairy cold chain, when we looked at addressing renewable energy for milk chillers, we said that, while, of course, we are addressing, say, some part of the problem of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions by replacing diesel-based milk chillers by solar, there's also the aspect of the fodder of the livestock that also is contributing to, a large part of the emission. So it's that, so while of course we started with our focus on looking at the energy transition for milk chillers, but then we said that, okay, if we have to look at the problem, it has to look at others. And, there are limitations of resources and time, but I think it's that whole understanding that climate is a horizontal and you will have to look at a problem, and one ship which will steer climate action, which we heard a lot, is partnership. So a lot of the evidence data that you generate could serve as, useful reference for others. The other sector that we looked at energy transition was water and wastewater, more from the urban utility space, because, in some of our work, and maybe I'll touch upon this because this was a key component of our coastal cities initiatives also, that a large part in some of the studies that, our partners have done, around 50 to 60% of the energy bill in a utility goes in energy, of course, water, wastewater provisioning. So we said, can energy transition be, like an opportunity where we work with urban utilities to advance energy transition in the water and wastewater sector. The third was the productive use of renewable energy, because again, both, for us as, as a CSR in India, it becomes important that while there are global programs and global KPIs, you also have to, marry it of course, what your Schedule 7 says, but also more importantly, programs that create developmental outcome. So the productive use of renewable energy was one area where, we are looking at how renewable energy solutions can, say, help rural businesses and others. So that's the work on energy transition. The area of work was nature-based solution. And this is where our climate resilient coastal cities initiatives also, fits in, which is basically more, which looked at more. The definition of nature-based solutions came many years ago by IUCN. But I think our approach to nature-based solution is that how three aspects. One, of course, protection of natural resources, conservation of natural ecosystems, strongly looking at livelihood, and third, of course, is carbon sequestration as a pillar. If I could also touch upon, you said that what are we doing on climate, and I focused my submission on the philanthropic programs. But I think there are certain, I would say, challenges that we faced. First and foremost was methodologies. I think when we talk of how do you measure, it's easy, how do you measure sequestration? While of course there are global methodologies, global formulas, we realize that you need to customize or bring it down to the local relevance. So, how can you assess, say, carbon sequestration potential of, say, mangroves, of wetlands? So, as part of our work, we have tried to, work on, catalyze some of our investments on research to develop certain methodologies which are more, which can use data that is available in India, which can use evidence that is available in India. So we are looking at, just for an example, we have looked at, so wetland as an area of, conservation. We are doing a study to say that what is the carbon sequestration methodology for 3 types of wetland: inland, coastal, and high altitude. Because I think having some of the local methodologies will help in building the evidence. Second is data. We all spoke about it. I think in the whole sphere of climate, there is either analysis which are, say, very top down. So you look at climate model, forecast, projections, but we have also realized that it is important to kind of integrate a very top down modeling exercise, which of course has its merit, with the bottom up. Because when it comes to the fact of climate impact, vulnerability, resilience, these are terms, but what does it translate into, how it is impacting, say, people's livelihood, or say farming operations, or how utilities manage their water and wastewater. So then we realize that a combination of top down, you need to look at modeling exercises, but you also need to look at aspects of resilience and vulnerability more from a bottom up lens as to how you impact people. And third, of course, is the capacity building piece, which is a key component of all our climate programs. Yes, maybe, and one last bit is, India's NDC, they recognize WASH as a key pillar to achieving its climate, advancing its climate strategy, but where surprisingly it was noted more as a strategy for adaptation. We strongly believe that WASH has a very strong mitigation component also, and that's something that we are trying to, focus in our work.
Thanks, Romit. Ma'am, what role do you think the private sector will play in this phase of transition of being climate resilient nation or net zero that we are saying?
So we're hearing about the public-private partnership aspect across the board, and I think that is clearly a space. And the reason it's called for is when only in public hands there has been, I believe, a failure to deliver the right model. So the hope is that by opening it up for private sector participation in a PPP model, which means the public sector has to exit sufficiently, because otherwise the private sector will not enter, that framework is looking for private sector engagement. I think in one area, as Ravi highlights, it would be the technologies that come with it. The second would be the profit models, because the private sector is not in it for philanthropy alone. There is some philanthropy, but it has to be a sustainable for-profit model. So that would be the model itself. And the third link to that would be the skillings and livelihood, because you can get that engagement of the private sector down at the SME and small contractor level. It can be at the large corporate level. But whichever level it comes, it needs to be in a model which enables profit on the one hand and enables meaningful engagement with the government, by which I mean government sets the policy but allows the private sector to operate. The good news is these models exist, and I think I would just overlay that with technology, because as was suggested even in the last panel discussion, the technologies of traceability, the technologies that enable better use of energy, all of these are available, and the private sector is probably best placed to bring it into creation and ensure that it's adapted for whatever coastal city, in this case, we take, because it will need some adaptation and in order to be adopted. But as we do that, I think who better than the private sector to take what's working somewhere else and moderate it for another? Because the way we are structured right now as the public sector is these areas are tending to be very local, managed at the ULB level or managed, if we're lucky, at the state level. That sharing of information, we find even in the work we're doing across states, is not easy because it's so siloed. But the private sector moves much more fluidly across states, so has the ability to go wherever it feels it's the right place for it and carry that information.
Ravi, you mentioned about economic models and contextualized solutions in your last. So whenever we go down to a state in terms of implementation, because all of these climate resilient coastal water and sanitation infrastructure that we're talking about, these are public infrastructures. So even though private players, of course, have a good role to play, and they all are very pro that, but we see that they do not still have the capacity to do the entire city infrastructure, which is a government responsibility to per se. So, but because of the standardized policies that we have and not contextualized, we face a lot of challenges when we go at the implementation and ground level. So what do you think, what kind of an enabling environment or support system or changes in the policies that need to be addressed in term when the government looks at programmatic responses to climate change?
I think that's a great question, and I'll share an example which I've been discussing with my son. He's an expert on policy, and we work in a particular region where the water connectivity is very poor. So I was just debating with him as to why is it poor, and then we got into the deeper aspects of the policy issues. And he says, see, where you are, it's not a part of a municipal corporation, and this is in Maharashtra. If you're not a part of a municipal corporation, that means you're being either run by the Gram Panchayati Raj, and as a result they have funds, but their priorities are not there, and by law they are not entitled to provide either solid waste management or piped water or potable water. Now this is really a conflict out here. So that means if you don't have a law and the priorities of the Gram Panchayat or the Panchayati Raj are different, then you're going to see a lot of solid waste pollution, which we are already beginning to see, plus the water issues, and then nobody is addressing that at that particular level. So how do you enable that whole policy so that it becomes a little more holistic, it becomes a single window clearance, and these obstacles which are there, which are related to, say, the government infrastructure of getting the permissions, accessing it, etc., should be facilitated by the government for the private sector to be enabled. Today, private sector, if they give a contract, private sector is supposed to go and do everything out there. And that becomes and puts a lot of burden, especially on SMEs for this particular part. So that is one thing where we need to relook at these regions, and can we create special vehicles whereby say that there's a single window clearance. They are going to facilitate, not really necessarily do, but to facilitate the access to those kind of windows. So that becomes easy. For example, in coastal cities, one of the largest challenges we're going to have today is with the sea level rising, you're going to get ingression of seawater coming into the aquifers. And if that's going to come in, how can the government facilitate the access to points where we need to bring in an intervention? Okay, we can bring in the intervention, but we don't have the wherewithal and the capabilities to basically maneuver the government policies, government departments to do that, and that loses the time. So that is one of the things which is very essential that government needs to do in this case. Second thing is on the planning part, and I've seen some very interesting models which have emerged worldwide, is the planning is thrown open to the best planners in the world. So they have a competition and they encourage 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 firms who are literally urban planners taking into account to look at the planning and mitigating some of the points what we have said out here. So if we do that, then we have to stick to the plans and bring that particular part in. And in those plans, the most important thing is that the climate change has to be addressed. And the way people are doing that is they're getting more and more away from hardscapes to softer scapes, which can absorb water, which can create not the localized hot zones, but localized microclimates. So there are a lot of initiatives which can bring, and government needs to facilitate that and do that. So that is the other thing which I feel is very, very essential we do that particular way. The third thing is that if the government is sending out the tenders or the proposals, and if they are going to be financing that particular part, then I think they cannot constrict the oxygen of SMEs, which is the cash flows. And that is something which is absolutely, people are very scared, including us. We would love to participate in a lot of the projects, but we get scared when we hear the horror stories from a lot of the colleagues. And I think we are doing something out here, but it gets constrained in some way or the other thanks to the bureaucracy and all that. Not to mention that we have also had a very pleasant cases with some of the public sector companies, whereby they have been saying that no, we want to implement it, we are going to facilitate it. So they have facilitated also very well. Okay, and also in state of Bihar, where we have completed some projects. So it is moving both the ways, but there is a realization of that, and if we can facilitate that, then I think things will be a lot more better. And the last part is, the bankers also need to play an important role out here. And one of the things which we find is the banks are not very ready to find a project which has been awarded, and they don't want to give a collateral or a working capital loan or certain things, So that is also getting difficult in this case. So if those can be done, which are very well secured, then I think there's a lot can be done in these things.
You mentioned about salinity ingress in the coastal areas. Though the states do have climate action plans, but I think Gujarat's climate action plan has very well addressed it, because it's already visible in Gujarat. So I think other states could learn a little more from that.
Why don't you expand on that?
Sorry?
No, just
It's a whole report. They have mentioned a little more about actions that need to be taken in the Gujarat State Climate Action Plan, which in other state climate action plan is missed out completely. Like, they're not talking about salinity ingress at all, which is there. The data is there, the stats is there, but no one's talking.
Very visible in
very
certain
visible
areas of Maharashtra also.
Yeah. But the action plan doesn't say that. Romit, what are the key opportunities and outcomes that you're looking at as part of the climate resilient coastal cities engagement?
Sure. And Mr. Mariwala, thank you. I touching upon the financing, this was part of my response, and maybe, I'll come to that in the end. But, Aditi, the question was that, so again, if you look at our programs, our say CSR programs here in India, almost 60 to 65, close to 70%, the geographical coverage is rural. And when we were looking at where to start in urban areas, I think the question was that, which geography do you select? And I think, and here, of course, Natasha is not, I think, like we were also guided that a lot of the discourse on urban has happened, and climate, has happened for, like the Mumbai, you have a climate action plan for Bombay, metros and other larger cities, very valid, a large population, stays there, the vulnerability to that. But, I think our beginning point was that can we look at tier 2 and tier 3 cities? These are cities which, are, say, with a population of 50,000 to, 1 lakh, 1,50,000, 2 lakh. There is, in the whole, I think that the net zero debate where, say the Delhis and the Bombays and the Bengalurus are, having discussions around how to move towards net zero. We see, these tier 2 and tier 3 cities being left out. So we thought, why don't we look at, in terms of, the segmentation, or in terms of the cities that we looked at, we said that we will focus on tier 2 and tier 3 cities, because there is a, and, so that was one aspect in terms of why we selected, the towns that we will work with. And the second was why West Coast, because, while of course data, has pointed and that the vulnerability of the West Coast in the recent years, in terms of the nature and the extent of disasters that has happened, have increased. So we say, and of course these are states. The states that we are looking as part of this initiative is Karnataka, Goa, Maharashtra, and Gujarat. So a large part of, one is of course population, but also economy. Almost close to, I think, 40% of the GDP of the country comes from, these large states. So that's, so primarily because of the vulnerability, we chose the West Coast. Second, and I was, mentioning your name that, where do we begin? We said that we will look at tier 2 and 3 cities because this is something that is not being, looked into. There are three key, and, I think before I, move ahead, I think it's, we are privileged to be partnering with ISC, Natasha, Aditi, your organization, CDD, and IIT Bombay. So this is a 3-organization partnership where CDD will look at, CDD will look at demonstrating nature-based solution across, like 3 cities in Maharashtra. IIT will do state-level analysis to look at how the vulnerability of tier 2 and tier 3 cities is against climate, and how, again, what are the solutions that, say, the utilities as well as the urban development departments could look at to mainstream some of the climate risk in their decision making. And ISC will, will steer this. There's an anchor organization for this initiative who will provide their research, knowledge inputs, and also facilitate a lot of the policy discourse happening both at the state and central level. The 3 key aspects of this work: technology, policy, and finance. On the technology piece, I think, while because we have commissioned work on this and this is still work in progress, in a similar tone, a project that we have again for tier 2 and tier 3 cities in Maharashtra with one of our other partners called CEPT, we tried to look at developing a EV-based sludge, vehicle. And we realized the biggest problem that was for us was that, we couldn't find a chassis for a, EV-based sludge vehicle. So, of course, then conversations happen and we tied up with a leading motor company and a prototype is being developed. But again, here I think when we look at, again, and I was saying that there is a strong mitigation angle to also the work that we do on climate in cities. So that whole aspect of technology is important, where Aditi, your organization will demonstrate technologies of how nature-based solutions can help in addressing water and wastewater problem. Policy, of course, is an important dimension, because a lot of these things, like a lot of the discourse is around Swachh Bharat, urban and others, but Amrut, which is, specifically looking at other towns. So how could Amrut look at nature-based solutions in their work is going to be a focus which, ISC will lead and anchor. On the financing piece, I think there is one initiative that is currently on that we are doing is that could, what are the solutions that Mr. Mariwala you spoke of, could de-risk infrastructure financing? Because again, as I was saying, the large part comes around, de-risking. We are discussing, and, we don't have an answer right now, but that there are various pots of money. We still know that 92% of the development finance in India is public sector. Rest is, of course, all, CSR, bilateral, multilateral. Within the CSR space also, there are, as an organization, we face challenges because earlier the kind of investments that we could do, say in a partial guarantee fund or others, we cannot do now because of, like CSR laws, and our money is also governed by FCRA. So the whole aspect of how different pots of money can come together to address specific aspects, is an area that we are working. Who knows whether blended finance could, large philanthropic money be used to de-risk infrastructure financing. We don't know, but something that, we are keen to work on, because I think the best, I would say opportunity for us to catalyze private sector capital or others would be to, one, of course, to provide solutions, but also to look at areas of plugging where, say, some of the conventional, methods have, say, not been worked so far. So, yeah.
So Ravi, you mentioned about self-sustainable economic models, and I'll come back to that when it comes to fecal sludge treatment systems. So in fecal sludge treatment space, and I'm talking about my organization, Devanahalli in itself is a benchmark, and it is sustainable. So there is a whole ecosystem, because the Devanahalli municipality actually owns it now after we've handed them over. The co-composting that happens from the community, they make the compost there. Now it's being sold at 8 rupees per kg. That compost is used by agricultural farmers in that area, right? So it's a whole ecosystem there, and thankfully Karnataka government has all parts has been very, very helpful and supportive to us. So what kind of, apart from just this one small example, enabling environmental support system through all the stakeholders, because here even the community is very, very proactive, must be in place to support the government, because the government is trying for this transition. So what do you think should be a support system for the government to transition towards the climate resilient cities?
That's a good question. I think normally I get the question asked the other way. I think it's making me think. At first I thought it was a typo. But I think that's a good way. I think what comes out here is there is a deficit which I have seen from the private sector for enabling a thing which government is looking at. I think that's the way I'm looking at the question in terms of it. And I think that comes a bit from the two things. One is comes from the trust deficit and the demonstrated trust deficit. And second thing is that kind of a muscle memory we have of people taking advantages of these particular part. I think there has to be some kind of a mechanism by which we come out there. One of the mechanisms which I can think of, and I've been thinking a little bit about it, is can we enable something like there's an agency in Israel called Makrot. Makrot is a government agency which basically manages the water for the government. Can there be a partnership whereby they have smaller companies demonstrating their solutions and having a qualifying process whereby you demonstrate your technology systematically over a period of time, and they are not supposed to be making money but getting a grant or something to be demonstrating those things. And once they are demonstrated, they are basically onboarded on this to particularly do that particular part. So that is one thing which one can look at it. The second thing is the private sector also needs to look at evaluating the technology. I think in the rush for startups, they're not looking at the length and breadth of what their technology can enable. And this is something I basically mentor a lot of the IIT students in their third and fourth year. I tell them that you want to do a startup, forget the market end right now. First, make sure that things are working well. I think the private sector has to have that kind of robust solutions, and we have to work hard. We have to realize that the timescales of the technologies what we are talking are very different from the timescales of the IT technologies. Those are decimated very fast, very quickly through internet distribution channels, and they don't require a physical infrastructure in place. So we require physical infrastructure in place which is multidisciplinary. So the private sector needs to learn that they have to work across discipline. They can't say I'm only going to do chemicals and not going to do the structural part. It's an integral part of the solution. So they will need to have the skill sets which are across the board, or have partnerships which can do that particular part. I think that has been my largest learning in this matter, that you can't work in isolation. You have nature-based solutions today. I need to work with civil engineers, I need to work with chemical engineers, I need to work with botanists, I need to work with biologists, and of course I need to work with social scientists. So it's a across the board thing. So I think private sector has to realize that. And I said, if I'm not going to do that or focus do that, and which are the older models, I think that's changing, and looking at solution as a service will enable the implementation of these kind of technology. Will have the government, they will support the government in that particular manner, that we are coming up with a full solution which is across the board, and the government, I think, then can start listening to this particular part, and that's what I feel in this case would be the need of the hour.
Thank you. Ma'am, one last question to you. Like we've all spoken about that there is no standard solution, and it's got to be contextualized or mixed. So what do you think is the pathway and solution mix that India as a country should adopt to cater to climate change overall?
I think before we get to what India should adopt, it's going to be about getting these projects, I won't call them pilots, but the projects that are replicable. And they exist. I think one of the journeys that we embarked on at ISC was to ensure that there would be sharing of information, that for every project that you identify, it may need some changes at the margin, but the core of it may be applicable. How can we ensure that the replicable projects work? And to that, I would add there may be possibilities of projects which have worked elsewhere in the world, which we also bring in. So rather than start up there, I think we need to start down here and find these few examples which are, and that is, I think, also one of the motives ultimately of the HSBC study, that if we can create the right models going forward, then those models form the framework for what could become the overarching policy to enable replication across the board. But we are not there yet. So some of it may be hopefully documentation of what is working. Others will be about finding solutions to challenges that exist, which includes financing and solutions therein. And then we say, okay, so here's the way that it can move forward. So the whole purpose of both this and the other project you'll hear about, Godrej, is really to look at finding these models or ensuring that we can document them in a way that they become replicable.
Thank you. Any questions, anyone? It's open. Questions?
Yeah, there's one in the front.
Yes.
There's a mic.
Talking about nature-based solutions, and one problem which we often read about them is prescribing a standard, where you look at technologies where standards are prescribed and it's easy to monitor. Often for nature-based solutions, it's difficult to monitor if they are, adhering to those prescribed standards or not. So how do you tackle that?
So nature-based solutions, by definition, are contextualized. So they're never standardized solutions. So every time you design a solution, the monitoring indicators are based on the solutions that you're designing. And that's how it works. It does not have a standard solution for any geography.
Yeah. And just to add, sir, we realize is that, to kind of any nature-based solution that is logged, it will be virtually impossible to categorize under a programmatic KPIs, because that is where you are limiting yourself to what the solution can offer, because sometimes what you can get may be very different from what you actually set out for. So in that sense, those are evolving, and I think that is part of the learning and the implementation journey that we undertake.
I have a slightly different take on the whole thing. Okay. I believe that you can get a definitive answer in terms of what is the parameters you're going to get at the output, provided you know what the input is and you can guarantee the input within a certain range. Okay. And that's a wide range. The key thing which I feel, because I deal also with a lot of the nature-based solutions, which is lacking is enough fundamental understanding of the processes going on at that particular level. And these processes are just not our physical and chemical sciences processes, but also the fluid processes which are going down out there. So in fact, we are actively, very, very, very actively looking at that, because I had a brief chat with Prabhakar this morning in terms of intensification of these technologies as we talk, which can be scaled across the country, and what involves in scalability that. I think that is something which is it's a very important question to answer, and what it entails. So there is a lot of learning still to be done out there. I'm not taking anything away from what Aditi has said or Amit has said, but I'm just saying that there is a direction to move forward, we think, and we should be putting in a lot more effort into that, and that's got its own reasons. Why should we be doing that? Because it really helps in reducing our carbon emissions. It helps in, but we have to mitigate some of the issues which are there for scale up.
Just to add, so when we do the theory of change of a project, when the end goal is clear, the indicators or KPIs, as Rohit is mentioning, can be defined after a detailed baseline has been done. Now, for instance, for a simple thing like a wastewater treatment through nature-based solution, the output will keep changing. The eventual outcome will be the same, but output will keep changing depending on the level of contamination of the water and then the level of solutioning that is being provided. So only after the detailed baseline and quantitative analysis has been done can we define the indicators, just a sample. It is applicable across. So unless not a deep. So for other interventions, whether it's standardized solutioning, you can give a proposal, but without a baseline here, we can't even give a detailed proposal as to what will we produce as an outcome or output.